Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're heading into Central Africa, exploring a country with a really unique nickname. Africa in miniature.
That's Cameroon.
Exactly. It's just incredibly rich in, well, everything, languages, ethnic groups, religions, cultures. It really feels like the whole continent packed into one place.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, the name, it actually comes from Portuguese explorers back in, 1472?
That's right.
They saw a river just teeming with crayfish, apparently, and called it Rio dos Camarões, the Shrimp River.
Yeah, it's a great origin story, and it really sets the stage, doesn't it, for just how much history is layered into this country.
For sure.
So our mission today is to really unpack that complex history. We want to look at its early, sort of shrouded pre-colonial past,
Right.
then dive into the impact of colonialism, the path to independence, which was complicated, and the big issues Cameroon faces today.
Well, we've got some solid sources to draw on.
We do. We've looked at historical works, academic papers, including stuff by scholars like Dr. Sira Vadanoara-Vatara, to really pull out the key insights for you.
Okay, let's jump in. Starting way back with this land of ancient roots and incredibly diverse peoples.
Right. So when we talk about the earliest history, well, archaeology gives us our best clues.
What have we found?
We're talking ancient settlements, spearheads, some dating back as far as 8,000 BC.
Wow, 8,000 BC.
Yeah, and this fits with the idea that the first people might have entered the region from the north.
Okay.
And it gets even more fascinating. Some geographical studies suggest Cameroon might have been a kind of fountain of human origins.
A cradle of evolution.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Linked to these huge ancient primordial lakes that used to be there. It suggests a really deep ancient connection to human development.
That's profound.
And the sources paint this picture of vast forests, like an inexhaustible treasure house, And the people living there were largely Neolithic.
So who are these first inhabitants, the ones who really shaped the land early on?
Well, the picture we get is a mix, but the Bantu-speaking peoples were really key.
Okay, the Bantu migrations.
Exactly. They started arriving around 3000 BC, coming from the Nile Lake area. By the 15th century or so, they'd settled across a lot of the central and southern regions.
And who was already there?
When they arrived, particularly in the northeast, they encountered indigenous pygmy groups.
How did that interaction go?
Initially, it seems like there was some peaceful coexistence, but the Bantu had agriculture, and that eventually gave them an advantage, over the pygmies' hunting and gathering lifestyle. So Bantu groups became dominant.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, definitely not. The sources mention some pretty disastrous conflicts, like with the Kulimang people, who were almost wiped out by the Amabu and Efra clans.
That's rough.
It is. But interestingly, the Bantu also managed to establish peace with other groups, like the Tikaru. And that peace held, apparently, until the Portuguese showed up.
So this mix of conflict and cooperation, it must have shaped their societies.
Absolutely. It laid the groundwork. You see the emergence of clans as the basic unit.
Right, based on common ancestry?
Exactly. And they controlled the land collectively. Political power often sat with the Council of Elders.
Chosen for wisdom, age.
Yeah, wisdom, age, knowledge, wealth, even military skill. These elders were really important, running ceremonies, settling fights, defending the clan.
It sounds quite organized. What about leadership, like chiefs?
Chieftaincy was central, often based on primogeniture passing down through the male line.
Okay.
But it wasn't static. It adapted, especially later with Islam arriving and then European colonialism.
How so?
Well, for instance, some chiefs up north became Muslim lamitos, and later, after colonization, some chiefs even, believe it or not, ran in elections, a totally new concept for them.
Wow. And the chief's palace, that was the center of power.
Very much so. The chief handled land, people's health and welfare, laws, disputes, collecting tribute, the whole shebang.
They had help, presumably.
Oh, yeah. Experts, relatives, senior wives, diviners, priestesses, a whole support system. But the relationship between the clans and the king, it's often described as pretty egalitarian, almost like peers.
Interesting. And punishments.
Varied. Fines, sometimes exile. It really shows these were complex, functioning societies long before Europeans arrived.
Right. So they had these vibrant societies, and then the ships appeared on the horizon.
Exactly. Ushering in this era of, colonial scars. The first Europeans we know who made contact were Portuguese navigators, 1472.
And that's where the name comes from.
That's the one. The Wouri River, Rio dos Camarões, Shrimp River, became Cameroon.
But others followed the Portuguese, right?
Oh, yes. The Dutch came, then the English, Swedes, French. but it was Germany that eventually annexed the territory in 1884.
And the Germans, what was their approach?
Their big focus was the hinterland. They were mapping trade routes, setting up factories along rivers like the Mbam, Nyongwuri.
For trade, resources.
Primarily, they wanted a monopoly on things like pearls, ivory, rubber. What's interesting is they didn't put much effort into, say, converting people to Christianity or setting up schools.
Different from later colonizers.
Very different, but their time was relatively short.
World War I.
Right. Germany got expelled. And in 1919, the League of Nations basically split the former German territory between Britain and France.
Under a trusteeship.
Joint trusteeship, yeah. Britain got the coastal bits Buea, Victoria, Limbe, plus a narrow strip up north connecting to Nigeria, which, crucially, cut off German sea access.
And France got the rest.
France got the lion's share, including the strategic Grand Nord region.
And this partition, it left deep scars.
Incredibly deep. The French administration especially was known for being harsh, exploitative.
Which bred resentment.
Huge resentment. Sources talk about an insatiable desire for retaliation that really shaped things for decades.
It's easy to see how those divisions would cause problems down the line. Then came World War II. Cameroon played a role.
A strategic one, yeah. Not just for military ops in Africa, but also as a key food supplier for the Allies.
And the negotiations after the war were crucial, too.
Absolutely critical for its future. Those Anglo-French talks stretching from post-WWI into WWI were super tense.
France didn't want to give anything up.
Not at all. They were dead set against Germany regaining any power and fiercely held on to their new territories. And America insisted France keep a bit of coast.
Which had long-term effects.
Massive effects. On settlements, how resources were used, the spread of French language and influence. It's quite telling that the final terms weren't ratified until 1961.
61. Decades later.
Yeah. And border disputes, like over the Bukuru River, they still pop up today. It just shows how those colonial deals created these long-lasting problems.
Wow. So those painful divisions really set the stage for the next chapter.
Yeah.
The road to independence and all its complexity.
Exactly. And nationalist movements really started gaining steam during World War II, around 41, 42.
Who were the key players?
Figures like M. Celestine Ndam Njoya, a headmaster in Yaoundé, started pushing for a nationalist newspaper. And then, crucially, the Union des Populations du Cameroun, the UPC, was founded.
That became a big movement.
Huge. A mass mobilization force, especially in French Cameroon.
And other parties emerged, too.
Oh, yeah. The Union démocratique du Cameroun, the Rassemblement démocratique africain that came out of the big Yaoundé Congress in '46. You saw similar parties popping up in British Cameroon, too.
Like the United Cameroon's National Federation.
That's one. And these different groups started talking, holding interterritorial conferences, pushing together for independence. That eventually led to UN votes in 1959 about the future.
Which brings up that big question. Was independence really granted, or was it fought for?
It's a debate, for sure. The sources point out that by the time the UN trusteeship debate happened in 1945, independence was kind of accepted as a right in principle.
But the reality on the ground?
Far more complex than just being handed over. It was this mix of international pressure, internal struggles, hard negotiations,
Right.
which eventually led to the reunification in 1961, French and British Cameroons coming together as a federal republic.
But that reunification sounds like it was messy.
Very messy, especially for the people in former British Cameroon. The sources call it a bungled process, created a lot of uncertainty, instability.
And Ahijo's policies didn't help.
His assimilationist approach really worried the Federalists. They suspected a hidden agenda, maybe to annex the British part to Nigeria.
Which pushed people towards secessionism.
It definitely contributed. It just highlights how incredibly hard it is to merge territories that had such different colonial experiences.
Yeah, you can see that. Which leads us right into the post-independence realities. Instability. Stagnation.
Right. Cameroon is described as a deeply fractured polity, and it's easy to see why you mentioned the diversity earlier.
250 ethnic groups, over 100 languages.
Exactly. Incredible diversity, but it makes the political scene really contested.
So what's the connection to political stability, or instability, rather?
A lot of it traces back to different elite groups trying to impose their identities, ethnic, linguistic, religious, onto the state itself.
Constant struggle for dominance.
Pretty much. And since President Paul Biya came to power in '82, the country's kind of swung back and forth between military rule and multi-party democracy, but never really settled.
And that flawed history you mentioned.
Yeah, built on conquest, displacement. It keeps fueling the instability. It's baked in a way.
Let's connect this to the economy.
Yeah.
That's been volatile too, right?
Equally volatile. Traditionally, it was agriculture, cocoa, bananas. But then, mid-70s, things shifted.
Diversified growth.
Yeah, mainly driven by the oil boom starting in 75.
Ah, oil.
Big time. By 84, Cameroon was the top oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa. Huge investments followed, industry grew, a middle class emerged. Per capita income hit almost $5,000 in 81.
That's a significant peak. But it didn't last.
No, the classic resource curse, maybe.
Yeah.
Since the mid-80s, it's been rapid decline.
Why? What happened?
A perfect storm, really. Oil prices dropped, agriculture declined, there were bad droughts, debt piled up.
And external factors.
Privatization pushed by outside bodies combined with, well, sources mentioned government naivete and corruption, embezzlement charges against officials, things like that.
So resources are there, but
But they haven't translated into stable prosperity for most people. It's led to this persistent economic stagnation, despite having more resources per capita than many neighbors.
a real cautionary tale.
Well,
Oil boom to bust.
absolutely. Mismanagement, corruption, it can turn wealth into a curse.
Okay, so this tangled economic and political history, it leaves lasting legacies. Conflict, rights issues, environmental problems, cultural shifts.
Exactly. Let's start with conflict. Those assimilation efforts, French and British, after partition, they really sowed the seeds for long-term civil conflict.
How did that play out?
You had this broad anti-French movement that brought together different unhappy groups, nationalists wanting independence, peasants angry about taxes, Christians wanting to worship in England.
The diverse coalition?
Yeah, and the French response was brutal. A scorched earth policy to crush the uprising.
And the Anglophone crisis we see today, does that connect back?
Directly, according to the sources. Roots in those WWII negotiations, fears about Anglophone rights being ignored.
So the partition created formidable obstacles.
Huge obstacles to building a unified nation. Trying to create a truly bilingual country, bridging the economic gaps between the two former zones, the border issues with Nigeria.
That Nigerian border issue was only settled recently, right?
The Green Tree Accord in 2009 formally addressed it, yeah. But the tensions were there for a long time.
And the feeling among Anglophones.
The sources say the post-independence government became alien and insensitive to their interests. It broke kinship ties, led to deep, festering resentments and frustrations.
It shows how long these historical divisions can last.
Decades later, absolutely.
Beyond conflict, there are human rights concerns, too.
Sadly, yes. Since the 1990s, there's been a rise in abuses, restrictions on free speech, press, assembly,
And state repression.
state repression, arbitrary detention, even extrajudicial killings, torture, excessive force against protesters. It's a serious list.
Are there other rights issues?
Concerns about gender rights violations, definitely. And civil society groups often face pressure scrutiny, sanctions. Some even self-censor to avoid trouble when they try to talk critically.
And the environment. What are the big challenges there?
Several major ones. Poaching, illegal trade in endangered species, unsustainable logging, cacao farming leading to deforestation.
Is policy ineffective?
There seems to be a big gap between policy on paper and what actually happens on the ground, plus state funding for conservation has been dropping.
Okay, let's shift to culture and identity. That's fundamental.
It really is. Cultural heritage is key for identity, for knowledge. But the sources point out something interesting. The whole idea of the nation-state created by colonialism often clashed with indigenous ways.
How so?
It led to a more materialistic concept of heritage, kind of devaluing traditional knowledge and practices.
And the impact of Western ways.
It implanted this sense of being alienated, a humiliation complex, as one source puts it, in the African and specifically Cameroonian mindset.
Despite the incredible diversity still there.
Right. 250 ethnic groups, all those languages, Bantu, Hamitic, Sudanic, Adamawa families. Many cultural practices have endured remarkably.
But the official languages dominate.
French and English often overshadow the native African languages in public life, yes.
And there's a paradox in literature.
A fascinating one. There's a rush to publish books, it seems, but the translation workforce is static. And there's this culture of overcautiousness in writing.
Why is that?
Sources suggest it's linked to African communalism in editing intense group critique, which, while maybe well-meaning, might hold back some new, really impactful work.
That's complex. Community versus individual voice.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance.
So how does all this internal complexity play out on the world stage, Cameroon's place in the global mirror?
Well, its geography is key. Its relationships, especially with Nigeria and Chad, are shaped by its location.
Because ethnic groups cross borders.
Precisely. That creates unique challenges. We mentioned the frontier dispute with Nigeria.
Right, which sometimes involved militants like MEND.
Yes. And more recently, the instability in northeast Nigeria, Boko Haram, the Chibok girls' tragedy, attacks on Christians, those cattle ransom schemes.
It spills over into Cameroon.
Directly impacts Cameroon's security. It forces complex international diplomacy and military responses.
So, facing all these challenges,
Mm-hmm.
what's the future look like?
It's tough. Cameroonians have been asking hard questions about justice, democracy, the economy since the 80s, often without getting clear answers. This has led to polarized politics.
Feels like it's at a crossroads.
Definitely described as being at a crossroads. Huge debt, economic stagnation, social problems, environmental damage, growing poverty.
While the elite prosper.
That's the contrast drawn. Sources even call Cameroon a neo-colonial state, profiting from a failed political economy. It gets high ratings for fragility, isolation, insecurity, oppression, poverty.
So there's call for change.
A very urgent call for a paradigm shift in how power is used and shared. But the status quo is powerful.
What about political reforms? Has there been progress?
There was that shift to multipartyism after 1990. Legal reforms repealed bans on parties aimed to boost civil rights. But illiberal practices persist. Things like closed party lists, huge campaign spending, they undermine real democracy.
And sustainable development. Looking ahead.
That's the key concept for the future, isn't it? Meeting today's needs fairly without messing it up for future generations. Justice, equity, inclusion.
Why is that so hard to achieve there?
A big part is the erosion of government legitimacy and effectiveness, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, widespread corruption.
Like in the fishing industry.
That's cited as an example, yeah. It just stifles growth, drains revenue. It's this tangled web of problems holding the country back.
So, reflecting on our deep dive,
Yeah,
we've covered a vast amount of ground.
we really have.
From those ancient roots, that incredible diversity, through the deep impacts of German, British, French colonialism, to the complex, sometimes broken path to independence, and these ongoing struggles with instability, the economy, conflict.
It really paints a picture. A nation once called the Star of Africa, now seen by many internationally as more of a powder keg, embodying so many challenges of modern states.
Yet underneath all that, there's resilience.
Absolutely. A story of constant change and the enduring spirit of the Cameroonian people.
So thinking about everything we've discussed, the multi-layered strains from history, that urgent priority for a shift in power, what do you think is the single most critical step Cameroon needs to take right now to truly start fulfilling its potential and move towards a future that's more equitable, more stable?